Good morning, everyone. What I would like to discuss today is the relationship between innovation, particularly social innovation, and what we call digital ecosystems. We know that digitization is a transformation, first of all, a social one, because digital technologies interfere on social interaction, so they change the way we stand before to others. To do this, I would like to address a small theoretical part. The digital world, digital technologies, fit into what we call the information world. This information world is what drives our everyday activities, because we all base our decisions on information. In particular, digital technologies have the ability to transform information that starts from the physical world into numerical data. This is a very important thing because it allows these data to be transmitted, replicated, stored much more easily. After that, there are a whole other set of functions that are performed by digital technologies, which are that of transporting data, processing it, or building applications that translate data into instructions. Then we have the implementation phase that returns these data through instructions to physical objects, for example in the real world. So the digital world is constantly expanding and invades what we call the infosphere and multiplies it, because it makes it much easier to access a lot of information related to the physical world. Here, what does this imply? For example, this changes our social condition. For many of us, it is increasingly difficult to distinguish what it means to be online or offline, because each of us is always connected to the outside world, and we have experienced this during COVID, that we could detach and make physical presence independent from location. That is, I can be present at some event even if I am far away, and this changes the way we organize our everyday life. For example, we have generated this category that is called the digital nomads, who, thanks to more flexible work rules, now allow to work remotely. It is enough to be connected to have a computer, but increasingly it will be possible to carry out even complex operations. For example, through telemedicine, it is possible to make diagnoses, listen to patients, get in touch with special situations, even without having to move directly. With actuators and with sensors, this can even go as far as diagnostic modalities, if not even of surgical modalities. Or, here is another thing that has changed a great deal, is the ability to work on learning. With digital tools, we can multiply the capabilities and possibilities of learning through interaction, because social media or other digital tools give us the opportunity to communicate and share information much more easily, and so this multiplies the possibilities of interaction between people. Another example is that of mobility as a service. Again, a very big transformation is expected, because the moment you can have cars that are offered in service by companies, it no longer becomes necessary to buy a car. So this completely changes urban mobility systems, reduces, for example, the number of cars or even other means of transportation that circulate, and allows for substantial savings in resources. Also, in agriculture, this has led to remarkable changes. For example, there is a lot of talk about disintermediation and reintermediation. It used to be that the farmer depended on the wholesaler who went to the field, was the only buyer, and therefore held market power. So the farmer's negotiating power was very limited. With communication tools or with online sales today, any farmer can have his own market and reach consumers directly, can communicate with them, can identify their needs and characterize their offerings. And this is a remarkable step forward for many farms that previously suffered from isolation instead. Even in the food sector, we face a situation where digital tools can help us make our food choices. In what ways? The first thing is that they can give us the information about what we are eating. For example, apps that tell us how many calories different components have. But sensors can tell us, for example, what we need, because they can give us an examination of our physiological condition, and then they can give us personalized instructions. In this area of personalized nutrition, it becomes very important the moment we can understand that diet is an important element for health, but it is also an important element for the environment, so we can be guided on what we call sustainable diets. Now, to get to the concept of the digital ecosystem that is in the title, it is important to understand how digitization somewhat disrupts the model of economic interaction that we have seen in the last century. Through the great connectivity that digital technologies offer, we are increasingly able to respond to needs that emerge in the marketplace through collaboration. So whereas in a 19th century type model each firm works for itself to try to get bigger and compete and overpower its competitors, in a hyper-connected world, every stimulus that comes from outside allows for multiplicity of collaborations. Instead of trying to grow eternally, I try to ally myself with complementary businesses to achieve the goals I set for myself, and this completely changes the way of even doing business. Here, then once we have seen these changes that are happening, we can ask ourselves how the digital transition can be a driver of sustainable development. And to do this, we need to understand the nature of the transition. The nature of the transition is really a transition between an initial system state to instead a desired state. And this transition is not a linear transition. It undergoes several obstacles. In many cases, you have to go back, because every change then generates chain reactions. So we need to be able to understand these mechanisms, identify the right path, and adjust the path according to what may be, let's say, the reactions of the system itself. To do this, we need innovation, which, however, must have certain characteristics, and we talk today more and more about transformative innovation. What does transformative innovation mean? It means innovation that is able to go to the root of the problems, because if we deal with the problem only by treating the symptoms, in reality, this problem will reoccur. Indeed, it will even probably propose itself in an even more, let's say, pronounced way. Instead, transformative innovation is the one that goes to the root of the problems and tries to solve them starting from its causes. To do this, it must be a systemic innovation. So it must have a systemic approach, understanding that every problem has multiple causes and effects, must be multidimensional, and thus understand that each problem has several dimensions. And finally, it must be accountable. Accountability is a very important aspect, because in the face of the possible changes that each innovation generates, it is necessary to be able to understand in advance those effects that the technology might produce, not only the expected ones, but also the unexpected ones. So transformative innovation goes to the root of problems. And so in order to do this, it challenges established paradigms, even established mindsets. In some ways, it changes the way we think, and in some cases, it demolishes, it rebuilds. Think of electric cars. Electric cars require a radical change in the infrastructure. Instead of gasoline, we have electricity, and instead of the pipes that carry gasoline, we will need electrical connections. So it is an innovation that even before it rebuilds, it demolishes and inevitably reshapes our daily life. So, technology, nature, and society are linked together. That is, when we talk about innovation, we cannot only talk about technological innovation, because every technological innovation involves social changes. And the important thing here is to understand that social changes can themselves also be transformative factors and can also invoke technological innovations. Here in this diagram, we see a simplified system diagram where the system activities that are in the center of this circle are implemented by actors through technologies that act on natural resources through rules. And here in this system approach, we see where the possible social innovations are. For example, we can change the rules, and the rules are not only the rules, the existing norms, but they are also, for example, the moral criteria. And these rules can change our activities and consequently also change the technologies. The actors themselves change identities by having different social norms. All this generates effects that in turn affect both the activities of the system and also external drivers. That is, external factors that can change our perception of the system, our worldview, and so on. So when we think about systemic innovation, we have to think about the fact that we are immersed in a multiplicity of relationships, in increasingly complex networks, and particularly today in the face of digital transformation, we are faced with the interaction between the physical domain, the social domain, and the digital domain. So our innovation takes into account the interactions of these aspects. Responsible innovation, as we have said, links the action or decision to its effects, and the greater the information about this link, the greater the weight of responsibility. If I know that by doing a certain action, I degrade biodiversity, or do something good for humanity, well, that increases my sense of responsibility in decisions. How do you develop this responsibility? First of all, by including the potential beneficiaries, but also the potential harmed by the innovation. Then the other aspect is to improve the ability to anticipate, that is to question with respect to the future, how our innovations could change society and the environment circumstances. And then there is the aspect related to reflexivity. Reflexivity is that property whereby when faced with events that change the situation, they also change our direction of innovation. If I realize that, for example, there are vulnerabilities that I had not considered, this surely should make me change my perception of innovation and thus make me change direction. The aspect of reality, on the other hand, is that the researcher is asked to be a participant in a more general change, so not to stay in his or her own laboratory and ivory tower, because research in itself is a social mission, and therefore in some way must be especially the public one linked to public goals, such as those, for example, suggested by the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. Finally, innovation must be multidimensional. So as we have said, it must have a technological component, but it must also take into account social components and also institutional components. Particularly when we talk about institutional innovation, we are really talking about the ability of organized entities to establish links with other organized entities to coordinate their forces. When we talk about governance, when we talk about policy integration, we talk about institutional innovation. And this has very important repercussions on the way we manage our daily activities. When we talk about social innovation, we reason about the possibility of create social capital. Social capital is the ability of groups of people to cooperate, to share, to create trust, and then to collaborate. And the ability to cooperate, this ability to coordinate, has the effect of creating social value. So if I improve the characteristics of the environment or contribute to greater social equity, I create social value. So social innovation, let's say, is characterized by its ability to create social capital, and at the same time to create social value, so that innovation is precisely an increase in both the ability to cooperate and the value that is created. So there can be so many different aspects. however approached through, let's say, the same lens. So when faced with the same problem, I can see how to combine different forms of innovation. For example, with social media, I can create value through communication, and through networking and coordination, I can create social capital. The same, for example, through technologies that facilitate my access to data. I can have the ability to make more people have access to this data, and thus ensure participation and also ensure a return information that allows for better decisions. Or through data sharing, I can create social capital. So we see that there is always a technological factor that can facilitate social value creation, social capital creation, or an innovation that starts from the social, that stimulates technological innovations that meet these needs. So to go to the conclusions, it is necessary to adopt digitization strategies, because if we were to simply follow the market and not be proactive in choosing technologies, in directing innovation, we would risk suffering this innovation and having effects that are perhaps undesirable, and therefore we cannot entrust digitalization only to the market. We must direct this digitalization, and we must try to imagine it as a collective creation process in which the needs of technologies are compared and incorporated by innovators to obtain innovation trajectories that are the desired ones. Then we need understand that digitization is an adaptive process precisely because we have complex systems, there are unknown effects, and then we need to be able to work to adapt to those effects and adjust our focus from time to time. And with that, I thank you for your attention.